Luke chapter 6, now it happened that Jesus, was passing through some grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating the grain. Some of the Pharisees said, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus is held responsible for the actions of his disciples, and these guys are kind of like the self-appointed Sabbath police who've decided that what the disciples are doing is breaking the Sabbath law. And in the Sabbath, they were supposed to rest, and you get the impression that the Pharisees are keeping a close eye on Jesus and his people, and they can't even walk through a grain field on the Sabbath day without a couple of Pharisees popping up to criticize. Now, what the disciples did here was to pick these heads of grain and rub the husk off, probably, and eat them. Now, that might strike us as maybe they were stealing, but in Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verses 24 and 25, when you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat grapes until you are fully satisfied, but you shall not put any in your basket. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, then you shall pluck the heads with your hands, but you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. God had a provision in the Old Testament that they could go past a farm and grab an ear of corn. They didn't have corn back then, I understand, but they could grab whatever they wanted and eat it right there on the spot. They couldn't carry it away with them. They couldn't harvest, but they didn't need McDonald's, or they didn't have to take a lunch or whatever. They could just eat what was in a farmland, in a field, along their way, and that was fine. That was not stealing. That was permitted by the law. The question here was not stealing. The question here was doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath day. God had said to rest on the Sabbath day. But from the Pharisees' perspective, the disciples were reaping and threshing and winnowing and preparing food. All of those were categories that the Pharisees had established that they said you couldn't do on the Sabbath day. Their rules about the Sabbath were extensive and detailed and very impressive, that they would go to all that much discussion about the Sabbath day. They did not break the Sabbath law of God. They were not contradicting the idea of resting on the Sabbath day. They were contradicting the Pharisees' traditions about what you could not do on the Sabbath day. But Jesus responded and said in verse 3, "Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest alone, and gave it to his companions. And he was saying to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So Jesus brings up an incident in 1 Samuel 21 we'll look at here in a second, where David ate consecrated bread. And he mentions that as a defense of what he's doing. So a lot of different views that are taken about this citation of David and what he did. I want to talk about that with you a minute. Let me start with a couple of common positions that I think are not right, and I'll explain why. And then we'll look at what I do think the proper understanding of this is. One very common position is to look at this and say, well, David was king. As king, he had the right to set aside the law. And if David had the right to set aside the law, how much more Jesus would have the right to set aside the law? But did Jesus ever use his position as king to set aside a law of God? If he did that, was he perfect? Was he sinless? Was he giving us an example of where we ought to set aside laws when we want to? Would Jesus have supported the idea that even David could break the Sabbath law and be okay with God about that? It doesn't seem to me that that's a very likely position. One that's more common is to say that need takes precedence over the law. That if you're hungry, if you're starving, you can set aside God's law because there's a higher law. There's the law of mercy that trumps whatever laws God has on the books, so to speak. Well, think about that. There's no indication here that Jesus' disciples were starving or were malnourished. There's no indication that in David's situation, the men with him and David were starving. They may be hungry, but they weren't starving. It wasn't a matter of life and death. And if you can set aside God's law if you're hungry, what laws of his can you set aside? Can you steal if you're hungry? What can you do? I mean, there'd be no limit to that. And when in the Bible does it say it's okay to break one of God's commands? So I would like to look at this in a little more detail and come to the view that I think is more correct. Look back at 1 Samuel chapter 21. In 1 Samuel 20, now you know the context. Saul is chasing David all over the place, trying to kill him. But yet God had anointed David to be the next king of Israel. He did that in Bethlehem in 1 Samuel 16. So if God anointed David to be the next king in Israel, will David become the next king in Israel? He absolutely will. Nothing will stop God's purpose from being accomplished. Does David know he will become the next king in Israel? Yeah, he was there when he was anointed. He knows what that means. And so David knew he was going to be king. Now, if you look at 1 Samuel 20, verse 3, David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight, and he has said, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved.' But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there's hardly a step between me and death. I am this close to dying. There's hardly a step between me and death." He really thought he was a goner. Now, how could that be if he's been anointed as the next king? There's more than a step between him and death. There's at least his kingship between him and death, if he trusts what God had done earlier in chapter 16. So it looks to me like David's faith in what God did is starting to waver. He's starting to have some doubts about that. And so in 1 Samuel 21, David comes to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, 'Let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you, with which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place.'" Now, what was that? That was a lie. Saul had not sent him on some top secret mission. He was fleeing from Saul. He may have lied in chapter 20 in the deal about the sacrifice he'd gone to at Bethlehem and had Jonathan run interference with Saul to kind of get a test case as to whether or not Saul was really dangerous to him or not. So it's possible that this is the second lie. But at any rate, this clearly is a lie. Is lying okay to save your life? Is there ever a time when it's righteous to lie? And then the priest answered David and said, well, in verse 3, "Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found." The priest answered in verse 4, "There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there's consecrated bread if only the young men have kept themselves from women." And so they ate the consecrated bread, which Leviticus 24:9 is very clear. It was only for the priest to eat that consecrated bread. So he did wrong in that. And then he asked if there was a weapon there he could rely on. And they said, "Well, here's Goliath's sword." And David says in the end of verse 9, "There's none like it, give it to me." So look at all the things David's doing wrong. He thinks there's only a step between him and death, not trusting what God promised. May have lied about the Bethlehem feast, clearly lied about why he was there at the priest's house, and ate the consecrated bread that only priests should eat. David and his men weren't priests. And relied on Goliath's sword, thinking that that would protect him when he didn't trust in the Lord to protect him. He's not doing well. That leads to a whole bunch of things happening. And Saul ended up, after David tried to seek refuge among the Philistines, which also was not the right thing to do, Saul ended up killing all the priests but one. And in 1 Samuel 22, verse 22, David said to Abiathar, the remaining priest that fled to David, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household.'" David takes responsibility for the slaughter of the priests. I think properly so. He had in many ways failed in that. So when you consider what David did, and you consider how bad that was, and think back about Luke chapter 6 then, and what does Jesus say about what David did? In Luke chapter 6 and verse 4, how he entered the house of God and he took and he ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest alone. Jesus said it wasn't lawful. So Jesus also believed it wasn't lawful. So if Jesus said it wasn't lawful to eat it, Leviticus chapter 24 says only Levites can eat it. The context of 1 Samuel chapter 21 shows that David's faith is faltering and he's not really doing the right thing in several other ways. Jesus' disciples were not breaking any law of God. They were simply breaking the Pharisees' tradition. And think about it. Does Jesus really believe that you can set aside laws in an emergency? What about when the devil said, turn those stones to bread? Feed yourself. You've been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. Even after 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus did not believe he could turn those stones to bread with God's approval, and he didn't do it. So Jesus is not somebody who thinks if you're really, really, really hungry, it's okay to break God's laws. So I think the stronger position on this passage is to see the Pharisees' inconsistency. They justified David, who broke the law rather egregiously, and they condemned Jesus and disciples for merely violating their human traditions. I think that's a better position. I'd be glad to hear another one, but I do think that we see from the context of 1 Samuel 21, David did not do the right thing. Jesus said he broke the law, and so I don't think he's trying to use David to say, well, if David broke the law, we can too. I think he's showing that they honor David when he broke the law. They dishonor Jesus and disciples when they're keeping the law and merely breaking traditions of men. He comes down then in Luke 6:5 to say, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, which I think is saying that he's the creator of time. He gave the Sabbath law. He ought to know what breaks it and how to interpret it properly. And Jesus ultimately is our Sabbath rest. He is our rest from sin and from the battle that we face. So he's the Lord of the Sabbath. If anybody ought to know what breaks the Sabbath, it would be Jesus. In verse 6, Luke 6:6, on another Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. That detail is only in Luke's account. As a medical man, Luke probably often gives kind of more details. And think about it, if it's your right hand that's withered, you know, I'm thankful, and it's kind of unusual, I'm thankful that my Parkinson's went to my left side. I can still use my right hand just fine. I couldn't use my left hand for any good anyway because I'm right-handed. So most people are right-handed, so it's probably a greater handicap that his right hand is withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath so that they might find reason to accuse him. So they're just watching. They're not interested in the healing. They just want to find something they can pin on Jesus. If Jesus does work on the Sabbath day, then they'll accuse him before the people. And Jesus knew what they were thinking. In verse 8, but he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. And he got up and came forward. Jesus is going to make a public display of this. Now think about when Jesus would heal people, how he would do it. It was very common for Jesus to lay his hands on somebody and heal them. Sometimes he did other things. You remember when he spit on the ground and he put the saliva in the guy's eyes and so forth? You remember when he stuck his fingers in a guy's ears and then put his saliva on the guy's tongue? And so forth. Jesus healed in various ways. So look at what he does here. He got up and came forward, and Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save a life or to kill, to destroy it? Which is lawful? Is it right to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to destroy it? Well, who in the world would believe it was right to destroy a life on the Sabbath? Just wait. And looking around at them all, he said to them, stretch out your hand. Now, not even the Pharisees thought that it was wrong to tell somebody to stretch out their hand on the Sabbath, nor did they think it was wrong to stretch out your hand on the Sabbath. But Jesus gave a command to do precisely what he could not do. That was the problem. He couldn't stretch out his hand. But when Jesus said, stretch out your hand, the man acted and did what Jesus said, and he stretched out his hand. Now, what are the Pharisees going to say about that? Well, Jesus healed him. Well, they don't want to admit that. Well, Jesus said to stretch out your hand. Well, they could say that. The guy stretched out his hand. Well, they stretch out their hand all the time on the Sabbath day. It's just that this guy hadn't been able to before, and now he can. So they themselves were filled with rage. How do you feel when you get outsmarted? They were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. You know, they are so bent on, deciding that Jesus is evil, and everything he does confirms it to them, that they plot murder. You remember that question? Is it lawful on the Sabbath to save a life or to destroy it? You thought, who would think it was right to destroy a life on the Sabbath? They would, if it's Jesus' life. They plot murder right there on that very holy day. Murder of God's Son, no less. So what Jesus sounded like maybe being overkill really is a description of what they were going to do. They are just so bent on following their rules and traditions and all that, instead of loving God and listening to what he says. Then verse 12, it was that at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. Jesus is amazing. It's not like Jesus didn't have a lot to do, but he spends his whole night praying to God, which is certainly an encouragement. To see him doing that, it's typical before men are chosen for any job to pray. Look at the book of Acts and see that. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 24, they prayed and said, you, Lord, who knows the hearts of all men, show which one of these two you have chosen to occupy this ministry and apostleship. And that's when they choose Matthias to be the replacement apostle for Judas. They prayed before they did that. Acts chapter 6 and verse 6, when they appointed the 7 men to help the serving of the food to the widows, after they brought them before the apostles, and after praying, they laid their hands on them. They prayed in connection with those 7 men who were chosen for that. In Acts chapter 13, there are men and 5 preachers and teachers in Antioch, and it says in verse 3, when they'd fasted and prayed, they laid their hands on them and they sent them away. So they prayed in connection with the selection of these 2 men and sending them away. And then in Acts 14 and verse 23, when they appointed them elders in every church, having prayed with fasting, before they appointed elders, they prayed. It makes sense. If we need God's help, especially we need God's help when men are being appointed or people being appointed to special roles, we pray about that. Jesus spent all night praying. He really saw this as important, and he wanted God's help and guidance in this. And so when the day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles. Disciple would be the more general term, a follower of Christ. The apostles were these specially chosen men. And here are the ones he chose. Simon, whom he also named Peter, Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who is called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. There are a number of things that we could say about those men. There's a lot said about them throughout the Gospels and even the book of Acts to some extent. But I want to make just a comment about a couple of them. Simon, who was called the Zealot. The Zealots, at least by the time Luke wrote this, were basically terrorists who were trying to throw off Roman rule. It's kind of surprising that Jesus would choose somebody like that, together with a guy like Matthew, who is an ex-tax collector. You know, Jesus chooses some unusual people for his apostles. Several of them were fishermen and not necessarily college-educated or high-status people in the world. That doesn't seem to be what Jesus thought was needed. But then I want you to notice also in the end of verse 16, Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. You know, it's just frightening to think. Judas was specially chosen as one of these 12. He spent a lot of time with Jesus. He saw his miracles. He heard his teaching. He saw his purity of life and his commitment to the Lord. He heard him praying. He had all this experience with Jesus, and yet did what he did in betraying Jesus for money. So Judas is a warning that being close to Jesus doesn't automatically mean that we're converted by the Lord or that we're faithful to him. To think that Judas could spend that much time that close to the Lord and still do what he did just makes us sober up and think about what could happen to us if we're not careful. And then he says, Jesus came down with them, stood on a level place, and there was a large crowd of his disciples and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon. There were people from everywhere coming to Jesus. He had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured. And all the people were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. So you just see hordes of people, many, many people coming from many places to be healed, to have their demons cast out, and to listen to him. So Jesus was a busy man. No wonder he had to take the night to pray. He probably didn't have any time during the daytime, but he wanted to pray to his Father, and he did. So just such encouraging stories about Jesus. We learn so much from him, and just trying to understand lessons in this that'll help us in our own lives. In a moment, we're going to stand and sing a song, and we're going to encourage you to respond to the gospel. So do that while we stand and sing.
Number 800.